So immigration has been a hot topic.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
There was this Fox News segment I saw recently, and it really made me think.
Oh, really? What was it about?
Well, they were talking about maybe skipping due process for some people facing deportation.
Wow, okay.
It sparked a lot of back and forth, online and stuff.
I bet. It's a controversial idea for sure.
And that's kind of why we're doing this deep dive.
Yeah, makes sense.
We want to really unpack what's being said on both sides of it.
Definitely. Dive deep into it.
We'll be looking at that Fox News discussion specifically.
Okay, the one with Lawrence Jones, Brian Kilmeade, and Rachel Campos Duffy.
That's the one.
Okay, got it.
And we'll also be bringing in some analysis from the Ring of Fire YouTube channel.
Right, they tend to have strong opinions on these things.
They do. But our goal here isn't to pick a side.
Nope, we're just trying to understand the arguments.
What are people actually saying?
Exactly.
And then what would happen if those ideas were put into practice?
Like, what are the real-world consequences?
Exactly. So let's jump into that Fox News segment.
Okay, sounds good.
The thing that immediately struck me was this idea that due process might not be necessary in every deportation case.
Interesting.
They even mentioned the Alien Enemies Act.
Okay.
Lawrence Jones specifically said, and I'm quoting here, he questioned the constitutional rights of illegals.
Illegals, huh?
Yeah, that was the word he used. So what's the deal with this Alien Enemies Act?
Well, it's a law with a pretty long history.
I figure.
It goes way back, usually tied to wartime or national emergencies.
Makes sense.
It basically allowed the government to detain and deport non-citizens who were seen as threats.
Threats like spies or something.
Right, or people actively working against the U.S. or connected to enemy nations.
Some very specific situations.
Yeah. But on Fox News, it sounded like they were suggesting using it more broadly.
Like not just for wartime stuff.
Right, which is pretty significant.
It almost felt like they were trying to disconnect it from those original security concerns.
I can see why you'd say that.
Then Brian Kilmeade chimed in.
Okay, what did he say?
He made what sounded like a very practical argument.
Oh, yeah.
He brought up the huge number of undocumented immigrants.
Right. There's millions. We hear those numbers all the time.
He was throwing out numbers like 8 million, even 22 million.
Wow. Yeah.
And his point was essentially providing due process to that many people is just impossible.
Logistically, he means.
Yeah, like it would just overwhelm the system.
That's an interesting point.
And Rachel Campos Duffy seemed to agree with him.
So they're basically saying the sheer scale of the issue demands a different approach.
Right, they're focusing on the practicality of it all.
It's this clash between efficiency and rights, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so.
Happens all the time in these big societal debates.
Like, how do you balance those things?
Exactly. Kilmeade's argument assumes the system's already overloaded.
Which it probably is, right?
Could be. But is it due process that's causing the backup in immigration courts?
Good question.
Or are there other inefficiencies at play?
Okay, so let's move on to the Ring of Fire.
All right.
They had a really strong reaction right off the bat to the language being used on Fox News.
Oh, yeah, they usually do. What set them off this time?
The word illegals.
Oh,
They
yeah?
really went after that, saying it's intentionally dehumanizing.
I've heard that argument before.
They say Fox is using it to make it easier to ignore these people's rights.
Basically make it easier to justify harsh actions.
Right. They see it as a deliberate tactic.
Language is definitely powerful. It shapes how we think about things.
And the Ring of Fire folks were not happy with Kilmeade bringing up his law enforcement background to question due process either.
Oh, interesting. What did they say about that?
They basically said law enforcement is there to enforce laws, not interpret the Constitution.
That's a good point. Those are different roles.
They say that's for the courts to decide.
Which makes sense. There's a whole system for that.
Right. And they have another interesting point about the numbers Kilmeade was throwing around.
Okay, what about them?
They basically asked, does the government really not know where these millions of people are?
I see what they're getting at.
Like, if they have a general idea, why haven't mass deportations already happened?
Right, if it's just a matter of finding them.
And then they offered a possible explanation.
What's that?
The economic side of things.
Ah, okay.
Many industries rely on undocumented workers.
That's true.
So mass deportations would cause major disruption.
Makes you think if that's a factor in why it hasn't happened already.
Definitely something to consider.
For sure.
Okay, back to the Alien Enemies Act for a minute.
All right.
The Ring of Fire emphasized that due process within that act serves a specific purpose.
What do they say it's for?
It's there to allow people to prove they're not a threat.
Interesting.
Like they don't have terrorist ties or anything like that.
So it's a safeguard against mistaken identity.
Yeah, Exactly. It kind of flips the Fox News argument on its head.
I see what you mean.
They even told this story about people with soccer tattoos being mistaken for gang tattoos
Oh, wow.
and potentially ending up detained because of it.
That's a scary thought.
Really shows how important due process could be.
For sure. You don't want innocent people caught up in the system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the Ring of Fire went even further, actually.
Oh. What else did they say?
They argued that the whole opposition to due process might be about something else entirely.
Okay, I'm listening.
They said it might be a way to avoid acknowledging the good things undocumented immigrants contribute to the country.
So it's about maintaining a certain narrative.
If the focus is all on crime and threats, it's easier to justify extreme measures.
If you acknowledge the positive side, it gets more complicated.
Exactly. It forces you to think about the human cost of these policies.
Right, you can't just brush it aside.
So let's talk about due process itself for a bit.
Sounds good. What about it?
Legally speaking, what is it? Especially in the context of immigration.
Okay, so without getting into specific court cases or anything,
Right, just the basics.
due process is basically a fundamental right.
It's in the Constitution, right?
Yep, 5th and 14th Amendments.
Okay.
You can think of it like a referee in a game,
Oh, I like that analogy.
making sure both sides get a fair chance.
To present their case.
Exactly. It's about protecting people from arbitrary government actions.
Since it applies to everyone, citizens and non-citizens alike.
In theory, yes. And in the context of immigration, it means even if you're facing deportation, you have certain rights.
Like what?
You have the right to know why you're being deported.
Okay,
You have the right to present your side of the story to a neutral judge.
that seems fair.
And sometimes you even have the right to a lawyer.
So there are safeguards in place.
Even in immigration cases, yes.
But what about the practical side?
You mean the stuff Kilmeade brought up?
Yeah, the sheer numbers.
It's a legitimate question. Can the system handle due process for that many people?
The immigration courts are already swamped, right?
There are huge backlogs, it's true, but discarding due process might not be the answer.
What else could be done?
Well, we could try to make the process more efficient.
Like how?
More resources for the courts, maybe?
So they can process cases faster,
Exactly. Or maybe more funding for legal aid services.
so people can get the help they need.
Right. Another option might be to focus enforcement efforts on the biggest threats.
So people who aren't a danger could have more leeway,
It's about prioritizing, making the best use of limited resources.
while still upholding people's rights.
Exactly. It's a tough balancing act.
It is. And I can't help but notice the difference in language used by the two sides.
Oh, yeah. What are you thinking about?
Illegals versus human beings.
It's stark, isn't it?
It really shows how differently they view the people at the center of this whole debate.
Absolutely. Language matters. Illegals reduces someone to just their immigration status.
Like it's the only thing that defines them.
Right. But human beings emphasizes their inherent worth,
It acknowledges their humanity.
which naturally changes how we think about their rights.
It's a big shift in perspective.
For sure.
So it seems like the central tension here is this. The government has to enforce immigration laws.
That's part of their job, no question.
But at the same time, people have the right to due process,
And those two things can sometimes conflict.
especially if cutting corners seems like the easier option.
Yeah, but what are the consequences of that?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Gig time.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's go back to that central question.
Okay, what's that?
What happens if we start going down this road of bypassing due process in immigration cases?
It's a slippery slope.
Right. That's what worries me.
And it's not just about immigration.
What do you mean?
It's about the rule of law, about basic fairness.
Those are pretty fundamental principles.
Exactly. If we start making exceptions for expediency,
Or because the problem seems too big.
where does it end? What's to stop it from spreading to other areas?
It's a scary thought, to be honest.
It is. And that's what I want you, the listener, to think about.
What should we be taking away from all this?
Well, think about the arguments we've discussed.
Both sides.
Right. What are the consequences of each approach?
And what are the trade-offs?
Exactly. How do we balance national security
With individual rights.
and the reality of managing immigration in a complex world?
It's complicated stuff.
It is. But being well-informed means engaging with all these different ideas.
Not just listening to the side you agree with.
Right. Look beyond the headlines. Do your own research.
And think about the human impact of these policies.
In the end, it's about what kind of society we want to live in.
That's a good note to end on.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
And thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Catch you next time.
See you then.